So this morning I just wanted to discuss a little bit the difference between what we would call an information asset or information assets and a knowledge asset, knowledge assets. Because in a previous video I discussed the difference between information and knowledge, which I get asked a lot. And in essence, if I have some knowledge and I make it explicit in a book, when you are reading that book, if you don't know already, then that's information to you. My knowledge is your information until you go through the learning process to turn that information into knowledge. So let's have a look at information assets and knowledge assets. For example, let's take a recipe, how to cook a meal. Let's say you've never done it before, it's totally new and you want to learn how to do it. So you take the recipe, which is in effect an information asset. It contains information about how to cook. And you can then learn, turn that information into knowledge and experience, and you can apply that recipe successfully after a period of time. And when you've turned that information into knowledge and experience, it becomes, if you like, your knowledge asset. You can then continually refer to it in the future, because the brain may not remember everything, or you may just do it from experience, where it's totally, you're applying your tacit knowledge internally, or a combination of the two. So this asset at one stage is information asset until you've gone through the learning and experience and knowing, and when you know, it can become a knowledge asset. Another very good example of that I like to quote, because I was a private pilot for many years and I like flying. Look at the checklist that a pilot has before they set off on a flight, checking the exterior of the aircraft, checking the interior, checking the controls. All the pre-takeoff, pre-flight checks are categorized in one section of the checklist, and then you may have a checklist, a short section of the checklist after you've taken off, and in similar parts, intervals throughout the flight. Now when you're a student pilot and you don't know, you haven't learned these things, you haven't experienced them, you just don't know, then I would call that a learning asset. You're provided with the checklist for that type of aircraft, and you're learning it gradually. And then eventually you get to know it through applying and developing your own knowing, your own experience of it, not just information, but you know. You still may use the checklist because there are a lot of things to remember, and basically the human brain is not very good at remembering everything all the time 100%, so a checklist is an essential tool for a pilot. It's mandatory. It's particularly for professional pilots and public transportation. So in this case, you have an information asset initially, just as you may have a map and you plan your route. Initially, this information asset can become a knowledge asset which you apply. Now, if you take those simple examples, why does that matter? Well, in an organisation, time to talk about tangible assets. We're more comfortable with the plant and machinery the company may have, technologies the company may have, the buildings, the cars, the computers, the land. All these things we're quite comfortable with as assets that need to be managed. We can earn income from these assets if we apply correctly. And there's no difference really between tangible assets and knowledge assets, in the sense that a knowledge asset is tangible, can be in a tangible form, and we can earn income from that knowledge asset, or we can operate safely our aircraft with checklists. So essentially what I'm saying is that an information asset is an asset, but it's something which we haven't yet learned, turned into our own knowing, added to our tacit knowledge. And until we do that and gather that knowing, achieve that knowing and experience and continue to experience, you could consider that as an information asset. But once you know, even though you may, like the checklist, apply it continually, because you know and you've experienced it, it's a knowledge asset for you. And in our organizations, we are interested very much in identifying the key knowledge assets, first of all. Some of them make a big difference. Some of them, if we apply them well, can make a very big difference to achieving our organization's objectives. And so we need to first of all identify the key knowledge assets in our organizations. Those knowledge assets that will make a big difference. Clearly, there are different types of knowledge assets. People are without doubt our greatest knowledge assets, simply because people create knowledge. People can share or transfer knowledge, and people can apply knowledge. They are very important knowledge assets. We call them human knowledge assets, the most powerful category of knowledge assets. And of course we identify them, and we identify the key areas of knowledge that they have, of experience that they have. We can actually categorize these human knowledge assets, and we can measure them, if we like, measure the development of them through the development of their competences and experiences, or achieving academic degrees. These are all measurements of human knowledge assets. But in addition to the people, the most powerful assets, especially when we put them into teams and collaborative teams and co-creative teams, they, in addition to that, there are other assets in the organization that are not human, not networks of people, not teams, not experts, not communities. For example, key business processes which help us achieve our business objectives and make a big difference. If we've documented a key business process, to somebody who doesn't know, to somebody who's learning, you could consider this an information asset. There may be a process map there, there may be written descriptions, there may be tables, there may be all sorts of devices to document a key business process. But when you apply that process in the organization, when you apply it knowingly, with experience, as best you can, that's a key knowledge asset. So we come back to, again, the differences between learning and applying knowledge. We call these type of assets structural knowledge assets. They remain within the organization, they're part of the structure, if you like. Another example of a structural knowledge asset could be a patent or a copyright. These are written, explicit, and they're assets that we can generate income and wealth from. So the human knowledge assets are essentially people, as individuals, teams, communities, organizations. And the structural knowledge assets are those assets which are still very tangible and measurable. We can measure them, measure the performance. They are structural. And then there's a third category which is a little more vague, which most organizations call relational knowledge assets. Some call them societal knowledge assets or social knowledge assets. And what these really are those things that are an asset to the company that can be applied to create income and wealth, but may not just be the people within the company or the processes and technologies within the company, but they're assets with our customers. So for example, our relationship with our customers is an asset. Trusting relationships. If you're a trusted advisor and you've earned that trust over many years of applying your knowledge and experience well, that's an asset. And we would call that a relational knowledge asset. This can also be reflected in brands, successful brands, that somebody will buy a brand because they trust the brand, but it's actually a relationship, a trusted relationship, a relational knowledge asset. And again, there are ways to measure these. And that's why we tend to have three categories of knowledge assets in an organization that we want to identify, develop, grow, apply. That's the most important part. Apply these assets wisely to create income and wealth. Human knowledge assets, structural knowledge assets, and relational knowledge assets. All in the application. And let's remember, going back to our earlier point, that initially we might join an organization and not know the process, not know all this. This then becomes to that person an information asset. But once they know and once they apply, like the recipe to cook a meal, or the pilot checking, knowing all these things, but checking to make sure that they haven't forgotten anything important, they are then knowledge assets.